What's up, y'all? It's Shuffle, and in this video, we're going to talk about how to build teams in Darkest Dungeon 2. This is something I like to always theory craft, and people have been asking for it, so hopefully you enjoy it. And so we're going to go through the thought process, at least that I have, in team building, talk about some misconceptions, and then finally give you some examples of just the concepts that are floating around in this one. So, like I said, I hope you enjoy it. And starting off, we got notes off screen. Misconceptions about team building. So something I see in chats, like Twitch chats and Reddit and Discord and stuff like that, is people say, oh, you need this role. Like, you need a healer. Oh, you don't have a tank, LOL. Even a stress healer. The only role you actually need in this game is damage. The reason damage is so important is because not only does it end the fight faster, so you take less damage from the enemy, but there are so many just penalties. Like, mathematically, it's not good to focus solely on recovery because your recovery moves have cooldowns, they have thresholds, and the enemies just do way too much damage. It can ramp up, and it's just not feasible to run this super heavy control turtle team. I wish it was, but sadly, right now it's not. And there are a lot of enemies in the game, just in any region, that get stronger or more dangerous the longer they're alive. This includes bosses, so you have to end fights quickly, which is why I would say damage is the only thing you actually need. Thankfully, it's also the thing most common in the game, so it's not usually in short supply. The other thing to cover as a misconception is dance teams. So people talk about dance teams like, oh, it's really hard, you know, and it's scary. I don't know what to do. How do I make one and stuff like that? And it's fine that it's intimidating because it's the thing you have to put the most thought into in the game. You can't just throw 4 characters together with a bunch of movement skills and hope it works. The other thing too is with dance teams, you don't have to have a team where all 4 people are just floating around seamlessly doing whatever they want and looking cool and all that. You don't need that for a dance team. A dance team can be something as simple as Jester going from 3 to 4 and back to 3, and it doesn't mess anyone up. So as long as one character's moving and the team doesn't fall apart when that person moves from A to B or B to A, congratulations, you have a dance team. So we'll show some examples later. When I set out to make a team, I asked myself some questions. These go pretty fast in my head at this point because I've played the game so much, but the first thing I ask is, what am I doing with the run? Do I want to progress? Do I want to play for fun? Do I want to unlock stuff like shrines? Do I want candles? There are reasons to consider all of those things. For most people, especially newer players, I wouldn't focus so much on progressing. I'd focus more on getting a lot of candles and unlocking shrines and stuff like that, just to keep the game fresh, and it gives you more fulfillment, I think, than beating bosses, but, you know, some people disagree with that. The next thing to consider is, what mountain boss are you fighting? Unfortunately, this is something you have to consider in most cases if you want to win, because some comps are not good for some bosses. And yeah, I know British Brat, friend of the show, likes to talk about how you play a team for fun, you know, or whatever, not for fun, but you play the team without the mountain boss for, you know, 3.5 hours, and then it's one fight that you're building for. And that is largely correct, but if you are trying to progress and stuff like that, then it should be a consideration. But I also will say that a lot of teams can take a mountain boss, even if they don't seem like they can at first glance, if you're creative enough. So the next thing to consider is, what skills and paths do you want to use? So you can say, I want to build a finale team. So if we like look at Jester, we see finale. So what does finale do? It does a bunch of damage, and if they're comboed, it does more damage. And, you know, setting combo himself can be difficult because you have to like solo, and then next turn you get to do finale. But what if I want to do it turn 1, right? So you take a look. I want to do finale turn 1 because it's a bunch of damage, and if I upgrade it, it's even more damage. Well, we have Soloist, which gives bonus damage and minus speed. So how would this work? If Jester is slow enough, maybe someone can set combo before him. So you can pick a soloist jester and put him on your team. And then the next thing to consider is, how do we get combo? There are a couple sources of combo. There's stuff like weakening curse with occultist. There's also tracking shot. And so we can do something like sharp shot and have tracking shot, which we can use from anywhere, thankfully. And then we just plop Dismas somewhere. And now we have sharp shot to tracking shot on turn 1. This helps a lot more because sharp shot is faster than normal, and then soloist is also slower. So this really means that it's almost impossible for Highwayman to go before or after Jester in the setup. And so we can open with tracking shot, pick something, get rid of the dodge, combo it, and then we slam finale, and Jester moves all the way back, and this pushes Highwayman up, and sharp shot's not completely neutralized, I guess, because, you know, you don't get to lose half your range skills by going up in the rank 1. So that's just an example. The next thing to ask yourself is, what quirks do my heroes have? This is always a really important thing to look at, and it's also worth considering that even if they seem really bad, you can get rid of them. You know, you can go to a hospital, you can use the totem, you can drink wild tea and stuff. There are ways to get around bad quirks. So it's not a reason to completely disregard the character if they have them, but you should still look at them. So we always consider them. We look, you know, okay, we get debuff resist for this, but Head in the Sand's really bad. How do I get around blind? And then we look at something like Grave Robber. She's got Fetter Explorer. Am I going to the Fetter? I don't know. You know, just go down the list with that. Is Robust good for, you know, my damage dealer? Maybe not. Blight, not that common. Get some stuff like Scouting, and you just keep going down the list. And once you start putting together what you want to do with your characters, and you're looking at their quirks, you can start building the team and considering what you want to do. Because once you start seeing what you are capable of, what you have a bad matchup against, you can kind of plan your journey ahead of time, which is nice. I did say earlier that you don't need any specific role besides damage, and that is still true. However, there are things you should ask yourself when you are team building, because the less roles and type coverage you have, the harder it is to pull off a win. It requires more creativity, game knowledge, and some luck sometimes. And so it's always good to ask yourself, how does my team deal with stress? For instance, you put on Jester. Jester has a really good stress heal. That's good enough. I have one skill that can deal with it. Jester is now the stress healer. Or Bolster, for instance. The other is to say, how do I deal with HP damage? You don't need a healer for this, but the other thing too is that a lot of characters have a way to heal themselves. We only have a couple characters that can heal other people, like Plague Doctor, Occultist, Flagellant, Vestal, so that's about a third of the cast. But there are a lot of characters that have self-heal capabilities. Grave Robber, Man-at-Arms, Hellion, Runaway, not Jester, Leper, and the people who can heal each other can also heal themselves. So healing isn't exactly in short supply. The other thing too is when you're driving the wagon, you heal naturally. This really takes the pressure off needing a healer in the party. You just have to not die during the fight. And there are a lot of ways to not do that. There's taunts, such as Retribution, and blocking, and guard, and weakening enemies, like with Intimidate. There are a lot of ways to not take damage, which is why you don't necessarily have to recover damage mid-fight. It is a good idea to understand how you're going to do that, though. Am I going to weaken everything? Am I going to spam block? Am I going to spam dodge? Once you have that figured out, then you can understand how your team's going to survive. Another point to consider is, can this team handle being moved around? You may not want to build a dance team, but the enemy is going to try and move you at some point during the run. And when you get out of position, it can be really bad. A lot of fights can actually be won by the enemy just because you have to spend turns fixing their position. So this is an action economy type of situation. And so that's why it's always important to have moves, at least that can move one person while also doing something else. You don't want to press move and then just go up 2 spaces or back 2 spaces or whatever if you don't have to. So for instance, a team I always talk about using is this one. I think it's the best team in the game currently, and it solves a lot of issues in team building that we've talked about. And the other reason it's, really good is because we have someone like Jester who can just jump around through the party. We also have someone like Man-at-Arms who has hold the line and he can go all the way back to the front. Even if the rest of your team is entirely static, as in they don't move. If we have something like this, right? I'm not saying this team's good or bad, but if we had something like this team may have some trouble moving. However, something that's really nice is the fact that even if we get this random, horribly awful shuffle, we have something like Hold the Line that, sends Man-at-Arms straight up to the front. And these two characters are faster than Leper, so if you really need to, you can move them back and move them around, stuff like that, and fix it. Not ideal, but one person having a movement skill drastically changes the impact of being shuffled. So it's not a bad thing to at least have one or two people that can do this and have those moves equipped. Even if you don't press this move, and this is something a lot of people disagree with historically in like my videos and stuff like that, is if you have a move that you don't press, it's still good to have as a contingency. And like I said, people disagree with that, but what I would say is what you always have to consider, what move would you run instead that's more high impact? You have access to 5 skills. You're not going to need all 5 every single battle. So it's always good to have something in case the unforeseen happens. The next things to consider are how you deal damage. Does my team have reach? And does my team have a damage variety? So you could stack up all blight on a team and it can still win. It's a bit harder than normal because all your damage is one type. You can just run a direct damage team, but block is becoming more common as they patch the game and stuff. So direct damage might be a bit harder to do if everyone just does that. And so you need a balance. It's nice to have a little bit of damage over time, a little bit of direct damage, and most importantly, reach. So we talk about reach as how far can your team hit into the enemy party. Not everyone has to be able to hit everything. For instance, Leper doesn't really excel at hitting the backline enemies. He has Intimidate, but that's about it. And we have characters that aren't great at hitting the front line, such as if we run a Runaway in position 4 for Firefly, she can't hit rank 1. So it's always important to make sure that your team can kind of cover each other. So you have at least 2 maybe decent options to hit most ranks, and you don't want to make sure that only one person can hit rank 4 or rank 1 or something like that, just because in the events that that person gets stunned or blinded or whatever, or they miss, that could be very dangerous. So at least have a plan for that. So once we've decided what skills and paths and stuff that we want to use, we have to decide where people are going in the party. Even the most subtle choices, such as does Leper go in 2 or 1, can have a big impact. So Leper, for instance, usually better in 1 because he gets access to everything that he has, instead of having to give up Purge and Intimidate and stuff, which you may not want to. So that's always a consideration. And then, can the rest of the team function with what I want to do if I'm putting them in these ranks? So if Leper has to go in 1, is Man-at-Arms going in 2? Sure. Can he do what he needs to in 2? Yes, he can. Plague Doctor, she's going into 3. Would she be better in 4? She might be. Depends on the path. For instance, Alchemist probably wants to be in 4. Surgeon wants to be in 3. Physician doesn't care. So whatever path you're running, it's always worth considering the stuff we talked about, like what are your damage moves, where do these characters excel the best at. Thankfully, the game also kind of helps you with this, where if you pick your loadout, the intensity of these circles get a little bit brighter or dimmer. So the more bright it is, the more attacks they can use from that, or skills I should say, can use from that position. And then for this, it's how many of their skills can hit that. It's not an exact number, but it's a nice visual cue if you need to use it. So once we've decided what team we're using, their skills, what ranks they're sitting in, we take one last check to think about the regions that we're going to, the biomes, if you want to call them that. So am I taking a blight team to the Fetter? I might not. There are good blight trinkets there, but also my team is going to be way less effective in the Fetter because everything has blight resist. So am I taking them there? It's a worthy consideration. What areas am I avoiding? Same questions. What trophy do I want? Again, this is something that comes with game knowledge, but If I'm going to use Dismiss, Highwayman, for instance, and he has Take Aim, which gives him crit, might be a good idea to go to the Sprawl because he might get the crit trophy from Librarian, which gives you burn damage on crits. And then another thing too is if we run a team like this, we also have Runaway, and the final question to consider is Bounty Hunter. So if we are going to go somewhere that might be disadvantageous to a character, such as Runaway in the Sprawl, Bounty Hunter is going to have to come in and swap her out, which means if I want to get Bonnie some burn trinkets, I have to wait to pick up Bounty Hunter until I see the Sprawl, and he has to be there. If he's not, unfortunate, but that's just the risk you take, but that is always a consideration. Let's finish up the video by going through some examples of team building. So the questions, the thought process, all the stuff that we talked about before. And just starting at the top, whatever act I'm doing, whatever confession, and what characters do I want to use, what skills sound fun? Well, Flagellant's new. I played a bunch of early access, and he's the newest character, so he might be the most fun. So I want to play him. And what do I want to do with him? I want to do a ton of damage, like a ton of blight damage. How do I do a bunch of blight damage? So you go through his skills, and you pick something that looks good in terms of the blight damage. So something like this, we get a bunch of blights, sepsis, taunt, and necrosis, which means I need more blight damage on my team. Here comes Grave Robber. And then we can give her, a different path like Deadeye. Actually, did I give him a path here? Yeah, so Exanimate is the blight path, so I can give him this. And then, for instance, we have Grave Robber, more blight, which means we're going to run darts. And to keep her near the back, I have something like Shadow Fade and other things that help give her healing, stealth, and extra token interaction. And then finally, I shouldn't say finally, but third, well, here's another blight character, Plague Doctor. So I want blight damage, so I'm probably going Alchemist. I'm going to pick her blight skills. What buttons are not good for Alchemist? Incision, so I can grab another heal. Do I want more defensive presence with Ounce? That's something. Do I want to give someone damage? Can run Vapors. Do I want utility? I can run Magnesium Rain. And that's the third character that we figured out. And then going through the list again is how do we, because we have ways to heal. We have plenty of ways to heal. We have plenty of ways to do damage. How do we deal with stress? There are a couple ways, but we have rank 1 open, and that gives us a couple decent options. So we could run Man-at-Arms with Bolster. That's obviously the first contender. We could do a Stress Sponge type of setup, which we'll talk about in a bit. And we can use Leper. He can take a lot of stress damage and heal it quickly. We can also make Flagellant the Stress Sponge by using Endure if we wanted to move something around. And then finally, there's Hellion, who also has a stress heal. So for the sake of this and the ease of use, I would pick something like Man-at-Arms. And we have Crush for a little bit of reach. We have a movement skill, so he's always up in rank 1 because the rest of the team wants to be close to this formation. And so since I have this as a movement skill, I'll take Retribution. And there you go. Now we have a blight team. We have a bunch of reach. We can hit rank 3 with a melee skill. We can hit the back 2 ranks with a cleave. We have some big damage attacks. We have off tanking. We have a huge fun cleave move in Necrosis. Got the other stuff we were talking about, more reach with darts, more blight damage, movement, self-healing. Again, a ton of reach with Plague Doctor and healing, and then Man-at-Arms just takes up everything else. So I'm sorry if that went a little quick, but that's just, again, the thought process in action. So the next team we can talk about is, as I said before, a Stress Sponge. So you don't have to run a dedicated stress healer. You just have to run someone that can take the majority of the stress damage. So we could run something like Leper, give him Poet, just because it'll give him some better self-healing. And then we can put him up here. We could go super utility too and run Intimidate and Bash, so he's always locked in there. We probably want Chop. And as you see here, we have Reflection, which is a 1-turn cooldown, but it upgrades into 0 cooldown. We have a decent taunting move in Withstand. We have another stress heal. And then we have Intimidate. So we're constantly taunting this character, so the majority of hits will go to him. and hopefully the majority is stress, and he can work it off himself without having to do anything different. You don't have to like necessarily build for it. Other things to consider is supplemental stress healing. We could run something like Highwayman. So Highwayman with Sharp Shot does a lot of crits, and critical hits help relieve stress. Crit Grape Shot is very good for this. So now we have Highwayman not only keeping his own stress down, but randomly throwing out extra 1-point stress heals to the rest of the team. So now we have a bit of reach, we have some tanking, we have a way to deal with stress and HP. Leopard covers both. But just to give ourselves a little more reach and utility, we could run something like Vestal. So it doesn't matter really what pass she gets here. You could run Chaplain for extra tanking and stuff. Seraph is the easiest. So we'd run both Consecrations, for instance, and maybe Ministrations. So now we have some reach, we have a lot of buffs, we have Dot Cleanse, which Leper is a huge dot magnet, or damage over time, because his... where's this? Quirks, yeah. So his resists are just terrible. Even with Withstand, they're still horrible and bad. But now we have a way to at least deal with it that's also not Plague Doctor, who only gets 3 charges of Battlefield Medicine. Team could probably use a bit of reach and a little more damage in this situation. So we could run something like Occultist. And so we put him in the back, got a named team, very cool. And so how do we get the most out of his damage back here? Well, he can't use any range, or he can't use melee skills because he's in the back. I don't really need the extra heal because I have Vestal and a self-healer. So we could run like the Burning Stars package. We can also swap to a different curse. And how do we make our range damage better? Warlock. And so now we have a team that can reach pretty much anything with Highwayman and Warlock. And then we have a lot of supports. We can dump strength tokens on our damage over time units, or not damage over time, our direct damage units. We do have 1 damage over time skill in Judgment, but that is something this team lacks, right? So you're gonna have to find a way to help get rid of block tokens consistently or dodge and stuff like that. So your team doesn't just, run out of steam when it's hitting targets. We'll wrap up the video by giving a quick dance team tutorial. This is the one I get the most questions on, and we'll talk about it here. So with dance teams, as I said before, you can run something like the team I talk about the most. And with this, for instance, Jester having Razor's Wit and Fade, he can go back. Alchemist doesn't lose any effectiveness, then he can go forward. Alchemist stays just as effective. He can go forward again. And Sharp Shot's the exact same. Congratulations, you have a dance team. It can only be Jester moving through the ranks, but the team doesn't fall apart when he moves. That's a dance team. That's the most basic and simple example I can give you. But if you want to do something more complex and deep, or you might have more fun doing something like that, then the way you would go through it is you consider what dance skill you want to use primarily. So something I like to use a lot is Grave Robber with Lunge, because I'm a huge fan of that playstyle from Darkest Dungeon 1. And so for Nightsworn, for instance, we get stronger Pirouette and Lunge. Pirouette is a bit harder to pull off in this team just because Pirouette dazes her, and you don't want your damage dealer going last on turn 2. It's a bit awkward. And so being able to start with Lunge, we may still run Pirouette, and then we have our choices of self-heals. We could run like Absinthe and Dead of Nights. We could also run Pick instead of something like Absinthe, so we can, use Stealth for the bonus damage, and then use Pick to the face for more damage. But primarily, we're going to run Lunge and probably Shadow Fade. Or Pirouette. These are the 3 moves that the path is good for, and these are the 3 moves that we're going to consider when we're building stuff. So with Lunge, it's pretty good now, especially with the buffs. And we want to lunge as much as possible because Pirouette is good, but Pirouette, like I said, dazes her, and we don't really want to interact with that if we don't have to. So we have to figure out how we're going to make use of Lunge and get as many lunges as possible. This is where a good dance team comes into play. And so we know that Grave Robber is really fast. She'll likely go first in the team. So we're going to put her all the way in the back. We need a character that doesn't care about getting moved. We can take Vestal, for example. This could be any back row character, but we're going to take her as a healer. Next, we're going to take the unlikely Occultist for Aspirant. or aspirin or whatever. And for that, you know, this is all melee damage. We could run chaotic, sack stab, anamnesis, binding shadows as a move skill, and then some like Vuln Hex. Actually, Hex doesn't work too well with this one, but let's see. Actually, since you don't get the range penalty, you could still run pull or artillery or whatever. You can even run stars, honestly. And so we're going to put them in 2. And this team is still lacking a bit of rank 4 reach, so we can take Hellion. And we need as much rank 4 damage as possible, so we're going to take Ravager. And then we make sure we have a good setup for Ravager. So we could run toe-to-toe to get back up front, or breakthrough. Either works. And so now we have a team that ideally, Grave Robber goes first. She pushes all the way up into 2. And your team looks like this. That's your first lunge. And then for Occultist turn, use Binding Shadows. And this gives you the option to lunge again. And then this is your turn 2. And then you can pirouette and reset the whole thing. That's a more complicated example of a dance team, but this is how you get the most use out of something like lunge, where the damage is balanced around using it once every other turn. So either you lunge and then shadow fade, lunge and then pirouette, and then lunge again. This way you can do something like getting an extra lunge. There are ways to go really hard into the team building and make it so every single turn is lunge, but that requires a more, you know, dedicated team and maybe some trinkets and quirks to go into that. But, you know, that's the idea. And so that's how we get the most out of lunge in an example like this. So I think that's it for the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. Let me know if you have any other questions, and we can go into more topics like this if you guys want. Just let me know. And I'm still working on some other stuff like the hero guides. The sprawl guide is coming along nicely. That'll hopefully be up in a day or 2. And yeah, as always, thanks for watching. Check out the box for all the cool links, and I'll see you next time.